I read that you said you felt misrepresented. How do you feel misrepresented?
A lot of what the media has been saying is that I'm anti-diversity. I think that women are less capable of being engineers, and that's just really false. I simply state that if we want to fix the gender representation issue, then we should look at how the population differs, and so we can make tech actually better for a lot more women.
Why do you believe you were fired?
Well, I think that it was a PR move by Google primarily. There was a lot of pressure externally and by some of the very zealous followers of this ideology to get me fired.
It certainly seems though, and the memo, or at least what Google's CEO said, was you weren't fired for having different ideology, but you were fired for some of your statements on women.
Yeah, I mean, he can say whatever he wants, but that's not the true case.
Sundar said that it wasn't because you criticized Google's trainings or you questioned the role of ideology in the workplace. He said those were actually important topics. You know, what he said was what you said was advancing harmful gender stereotypes, and that was against Google's code of conduct. So it would make people, feel discriminated against.
I'm not saying anything about the women at Google, which is what he was implying, that I was saying that the women at Google have different traits. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that people that go into tech are interested in things versus people generally. And as a population, there are fewer women that are interested in things versus people. And we need to be cognizant of that if we're trying to improve how many people want to get into tech.
Let's look at some of the science. You cite research on differences between men and women's dispositions leading to gaps between them. The author of that research, David Schmidt, actually came out and said he doesn't think his work applies to Google's workplace and says even if it did, the differences are small. I just want to read you a little bit of what he said. He said using someone's biological sex to essentialize an entire group of people's personality is like surgically operating with an axe, not precise enough to do much good, probably will cause harm. Moreover, men are more emotional than women in certain ways. Sex differences and emotion depend on the type of emotion, how it's measured, where it's expressed, when it is expressed, and a lot of contextual factors. So a lot of nuance there, James. What's your response to what he said?
Yeah, and I agree that there's a lot of nuance and we should really dig into it. This was meant to be the start of a discussion, not the end all. And what the reaction that Google has shown is that no, we can't discuss any of these differences.
A lot of your arguments you say, and a lot of people shouldn't be offended because it's based on science. I just wanted to read you that because it looks like some of the science that you based it on, someone had said, actually, that's misusing my science.
What he seems to be suggesting is that I was telling us that we should treat men and women differently. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that to maybe make the workplace more approachable and uh, just better for the women population in general, we may want to change some things.
Do you think they're more almost undercover conservative or undercover alt-right folks? I mean, people who are kind of afraid to speak up in Silicon Valley?
Yes, there are many conservatives that are in the closet, quite literally, in Silicon Valley. And I mean, I'm a centrist, and I still can't express many of my views.
Are some of the, as you call it, in the closet conservatives reaching out to you? And if so, I'd be curious to know, what are they saying?
They largely agree with much of what I'm saying, and many have either left Google because the culture is very alienating towards them, or are thinking about it because it's so bad. They don't feel like they can bring their whole selves to Google, and that is a psychologically unsafe environment where you feel like you have to constantly self-censor yourself and you have to stay in the closet and mask who you really are.
How do you feel about the alt-right taking up your agenda?
I do not support the alt-right. Just because someone supports me doesn't mean that I support them.
Will you participate in the march happening Saturday?
Likely not. I still support Google and I want Google to improve.
Sundar said, we don't want women to worry that every time they open their mouths to speak in a meeting, they have to prove that they're not like the memo states, being agreeable rather than assertive, showing a lower stress tolerance or being neurotic. What's your response to women who might feel because of your memo, this is a perception that they might have to face?
I say multiple times that we shouldn't treat individual women differently and that many women at Google are outliers in many of these things. So it doesn't make any sense to treat them differently. I'm simply saying that there are population level differences that we should be cognizant of.
Many women I've spoken to, I think, were frustrated by the narrative that there are just less women in tech in general, without looking kind of at the history of, gender stereotypes, sexism, hostility, all of these things that go into it. Is it too simple just to say, well, women just aren't wired like that?
Yeah, so I do acknowledge that it's not all biology, that there are cultural influences, but there is biology too, and we need to acknowledge that. And what I was fighting against was the idea that any disparity in outcome was solely due to discrimination, and that's simply not the case.
Computer science, it hasn't always been dominated by men. It wasn't until 1984 that the number of women studying computer science started falling. So how does that fit into your argument as to why there aren't more women in tech?
So there are several reasons for why it was like that. Partly, women weren't allowed to work other jobs, so there was less freedom for people. And also, it was simply different kinds of work. It was more like accounting rather than modern day computer programming. And it wasn't as lucrative. So part of the reason so many men go into tech is because it's high paying. I know of many people at Google that they weren't necessarily passionate about it, but it was what would provide for their family, and so they still worked there.
You say those jobs are more like accounting. I mean, look at Grace Hopper, who pioneered computer programming, Margaret Hamilton, who created the first ever software, which was responsible for landing humans on the moon, Katherine Johnson, Mary Jackson, Dorothy Vaughan, they were responsible for John Glenn accurately making his trajectory. Those aren't accounting type jobs.
Yeah, so there were select positions that weren't, and women are definitely capable of being competent programmers.
Do you believe those women were outliers?
No, I'm just saying that there are competent women programmers. There are many at Google, and the women at Google aren't any worse than the men at Google. But I'm saying that there were many positions that were listed as coding that are different than what coding currently is.
If you had to do this over again, if you had to, put this out there again, would you do it the same way?
A lot of it was meant to be internal, and it addresses many internal problems that Google has. Really, the pressuring that Google does on individual people to make their team more diverse. And so it wasn't meant to be leaked at all. And I would try to change some of the language, but the core message would still be the same.
When you say you would change some of the language, what would you have changed?
So I think neuroticism, which is the official term in psychology, I would definitely change that because that has a lot of negative connotations.
Where do you think you'll go from here?
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously, I need to find a job at some point. So, and I mean, I like tech.
Would you consider a job kind of voicing these opinions as opposed to just like a strict tech job?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. There's been book deals and random things, but I'm still very new to this.